Good evening, everybody, and welcome to UMR CONNECTS. My name is Samantha Ream, and I'm a third-year student here at UMR. Thank you for coming tonight as we continue our theme of the often forgotten prisons, poverty, and homelessness. I'll introduce our speaker in a moment, but I just wanted to remind you that UMR CONNECTS is at 7 p.m. every Tuesday night. It's free and open to the public. Next month's theme will be the amazing human brain, and if you haven't already done so, please sign in to get your name into our door prize drawing. The information is only used to let you know of upcoming events, and the winner will receive a $20 gift card to the M-Gear store at the end of the night. And finally, without further ado, I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker. Greg Owen is a consulting scientist at Wilder Research, a nonprofit applied human services research organization in St. Paul. Greg received a PhD in sociology from the University of Minnesota and has led a wide range of research projects at Wilder Research since 1979, including major studies of hospice care, welfare reform, delinquency, child maltreatment, homelessness, vocational choice, and access to preventative care. In addition to many other studies, he has served as principal investigator for Wilder's statewide study of homelessness since its inception. Current project activity includes work for the Minnesota Board of Aging to evaluate their multi-year integrated services grant, consultation and planning work with the Northwest Area Foundation, the Margaret A. Cargill Philanthropies, the Northside Achievement Zone, and Leadership Foundations of America. Greg has served as an adjunct professor in the Health and Human Services graduate program at St. Mary's University, where he received the Outstanding Teacher Award. He has also served as a guest lecturer at the University of Minnesota, Hamline University, Concordia University, St. Thomas University, Macalester College, and Augsburg College. Known for his outstanding ability to work with diversity, please join me in welcoming Greg Owen.
Thank you. I turned on my mic. Is everyone able to hear me? Okay, hear me over here? Good. First of all, welcome. Thanks for coming out tonight. I just drove down from Minneapolis, and there was a couple moments where I was wondering what I was doing, semi-retired, driving down to Rochester on a snowy night, but I'm really gratified to see so many of you here and with some interest in learning about homelessness. I'm going to describe a little bit about this study. It's a very unusual study. It's the only one like it in the United States. And I want people to have a sense of how it's done before we go into the data. This study was birthed in 1984. I started working at the Wilder Foundation in St. Paul in 1979. And by 1983, there were grumblings at the city council in St. Paul that there were people on the doorsteps in the morning when people were getting ready to open their businesses. And so Councilman Jim Scheibel, who later became mayor, got a little irked by the frequent calls by the commerce folks and said, we need to do something. We need to find out what's going on. Who are these homeless people? And that's how I got into this very, very career path, long-term relationship with the study of homelessness. So this is one of the longest going studies in the United States. And unlike other places in the United States where they do ad hoc studies from time to time, we have done a triennial statewide survey since 1991. So 91, 94, 97, et cetera, up through 2012. And believe it or not, I'm back, even though I'm supposed to be 2 days a week at Wilder, I'm back doing fundraising for the 9th cycle of this study. So it's quite an amazing study, and one of the other really interesting things about it is the fact that it uses all volunteers as interviewers. And so before I leave tonight, I'm going to pass a pad of paper around, and anyone that is interested in serving as a volunteer interviewer on the study. And after I say a little bit more about it, you can decide whether or not you want to do it or not. But anyone that's interested in serving as a volunteer interviewer on this study, you'll have a chance to just pass on your email to me, and then we can say some more to you about what the study is. It's not a commitment to do it. It's just a question of whether or not you're interested. So last time we had almost 1,300 volunteers. Went around the state, about 350 different locations, including all of the shelters, all of the transitional housing programs, which are time-limited housing, but a little longer time than shelters, all of the battered women's shelters in the state, and in addition to that, probably 60 to 70 locations that are not meant for habitation. And the way in which we do that part of the survey is we scout out throughout the state through an agency called the Continuum of Care, which is a HUD designation, Housing and Urban Development designation. And these Continuum of Care sites help us construct an idea about where is the best place to go to find homeless people that are not staying in traditional shelters. And so with that, we do the planning to understand and investigate the range of ways in which people experience homelessness in Minnesota. So I'm going to just tell you about a couple of really long-term trends. Before I get into the slides, I want to talk primarily tonight about family homelessness, but I do want to talk about some of the trends over that 30-year period, which I think are remarkable. I drove down and I drank coffee all the way, so might get a little dry mouth here. So one of the first things to take note of, and probably one of the most important things and one of the most difficult problems to solve, is the fact that over the course of this study, we have had a significant increase in the proportion of those who are affected by mental illness. Now, that's a reasonably well-known fact, but in Minnesota, we've been able to document a change from around 18 to 20% who are seriously or persistently mental ill based on health system diagnostic questions, to today, in the 2012 study, 58% with a serious or persistent mental health problem. Primary diagnosis is depression, but we also see schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, a variety of personality disorders. And so one of the failings of America today, if I can be so broad as that, is the fact that despite the fact that we thought it was very important to deinstitutionalize and get mentally ill people out of places like asylums. In fact, I remember as an intro sociology student at the University of Vermont, one of the first movies I saw was about an asylum in New York and the horrible conditions, and this is 1969. And yet, today, despite our good intentions, we've been able to get people out of those institutions, but we haven't done similar work to solve the housing problems of those people that really cannot live on their own. And so our primary solution for that in the state today, in the Minnesota Plan for Ending Homelessness, and there is a statewide plan, by the way. In fact, the Rochester area, the southeast area, also has a plan. But in the statewide plan, the primary solution to that is to build permanent supportive housing units, and particularly to provide access to those units for those having permanent, serious or persistent mental illness. So that's one of the big arcs, that 18 to 20%, up to 58%. I don't know what we'll find in the 2015 study when we conducted on October 25th of this year. So keep your calendars open on that date if you want to interview, by the way, October 25th. But if we look at that arc all the way back, one of the other really important things is the change in the number of children who are homeless in Minnesota. And that's true nationwide. This is not just a Minnesota trend. But when we first began, this is before it was statewide, we were working in St. Paul. And in the St. Paul study, we went out and we conducted, at that time when Jim Scheibel was kind of giving me grief and saying, we got to find out more about this problem. And we met at a church basement to decide, what we're going to do about this. At that time, we just had a handful of children, women and children. And typically, the social service system was able to intercept those families very quickly. And so they didn't typically get shunted into shelter systems right away. Now, they were using what I think many in this room would know as flea bag hotels, sort of transitional hotels. The 80s pretty much ruined all of that housing. Even though it was kind of lousy housing, it was housing. But the 80s and urban renewal took away most of that housing. And so today, what we have is much less availability of really low-cost housing. You may have read that the vacancy rate in Minneapolis is about 2.8%, but the vacancy rate for affordable units, if you have a very low income, is basically zero. And so in those circumstances, you have to create systems of shelter and protection for families that are homeless. As you'll see in the chart that I'm going to show in just a minute, a significant growth in the arc of that population over this period of time. A couple of other red threads through this. I'm not going to talk about this very much tonight, but it's a very important red thread. From the time we began this study until the 2012 study, so we've got 8 cycles, 8 data points with thousands of interviews, there's been hardly a blip of change in the rate at which women are fleeing violence and becoming homeless. That has hovered between 18-20% to 23, 24, 25% in different cycles. It's amazing. We haven't touched it. We haven't touched it. So when you think of those 3 elements, and I'm going to throw in one more because I think the theme for this set of sessions was poverty, prison, and homelessness. 3 really depressing topics for America. Since we have the highest prison population of any country in the world. So one of the things that has also happened in the arc of this study is the presence of persons who have been incarcerated. So overall, the percentage of persons that are in the homeless population that have any history of incarceration is about 47%. So nearly half of everyone in the homeless population has some history of incarceration. 20% approximately, and that has not varied very much over the last couple of cycles, 20% have been incarcerated within the last 12-month period. So that's a really significant and important fact if you're trying to understand why it is that the shelter systems find it so difficult to manage what's going on in the shelters. It takes, I remember, I don't know if anyone recalls one of our police chiefs in Minneapolis, Tony Boza. Anyone remember when he was chief of police? I saw him he's in his 80s now. I saw him at a tribute to George Latimer. And Tony's son now works for the Salvation Army. And he's a great big guy, huge guy. And he's kind of like the guard at the front gate at the Salvation Army's Harbor Lights Shelter, which is the largest shelter in the state. It's about 5 floors, and it's one of the few places, and we're here at the home of Mayo Clinic, it's one of the few places where a person that has an illness, that has difficulty either taking their meds or staying on a regimen following surgery or release from the hospital. It's one of the few places that will take an individual who needs some time for recovery. But Tony stands at the front desk, among other people, or Tony's son, and Dominic, whose name, beautiful Italian name, Dominic Boza. But Dominic stands at the front desk, and if you're really looking terribly inebriated, you're going to get a breathalyzer. And then if you're not and you look okay, they will actually check to see if you can get into the shelter that night because of the risk of violence in the shelter. The Catholic Charities has actually started an ID card system. And so, you sort of, if you think about a pecking order among the homeless, one of the things that's true is that if you've got kind of a clean record and you're willing to be part of, kind of a check-in credit card system, you can have much more regular shelter than others that might be out of luck. Another thing that we've learned, and this is the last finding I'm going to give you before I go into this, the rest of this presentation, is that like so much of America, where poverty is concentrated among persons of color, homelessness is also concentrated In the metro area, nearly half of all of those in shelter are African American. Outside in greater Minnesota, and our American Indian population is roughly 1% of the state's total population, if you even including reservation lands, a little bit more perhaps. But if you look throughout the state, in greater Minnesota, American Indians represent 20% of all people who are homeless. So think about that. Think about the sins and scars on the American system and all of the people historically. I've just been watching this history series called America, and I just got through a slave period, so I'm kind of sensitized to that right now. But the point is, we've come through this horrible set of circumstances in the United States in which we've tried not to look too closely at some of these scars. The Indian boarding schools, take the culture out of the Indian, take the Indian out of him, out of her, or all of the sequela of the racial segregation, and prior to that, the enslavement of blacks as laborers. So I'm not going to talk a lot more about that tonight, but those are really critical elements of what we're dealing with when we're talking about homelessness. So if anybody says they've got the silver bullet Band-Aid for this, I really don't believe them anymore. I've been studying this since 1984, and in my estimation, this is a complicated problem, and it's the intersection of many, many elements of our cultural life. And so because of that, we now have a really significant and difficult kind of problem to solve. Now, one might say, well, geez, if we just had enough money for all the housing. When former Governor Pawlenty was a caucus leader, so before he ran for governor, he called a bunch of us over to the House caucus room. And he wanted to know what percentage of the people that were homeless could benefit, wouldn't have so many barriers and so many issues that they could just go right into housing. And this is about 90, I forget what year it was. It was in the 90s. That's how my brain works now that I'm over 60. It was in the 90s. But at that time, we could tell them, ooh, 25%, maybe more, didn't have a serious or persistent mental illness, didn't have some serious post-traumatic stress disorder, didn't have some type of chemical dependency problem that made them really unresponsive to just regular housing or unreliable in being housed in those circumstances. So we keep doing the same analysis each year to see what's happening to the population. How many would be able to benefit, and off they go into housing. It's available if we just had enough housing for them at affordable prices. And that percentage has dropped each year that would be able to go directly into it because they have few barriers that would prevent them from being able to live on their own in housing. So I didn't come here to tell you this is an unsolvable problem or a completely intractable problem, but I will say that I think since 1984, if it was an easy problem to solve, we would have made many greater inroads on it. So I'm going to just stop there. I won't take a lot of questions now, but if someone is just burning with a question, I'd love to try to respond. Yes, please.
That in comparison to, say, Europe, which has been more aggressive with, treatment of homelessness. I think in some places that where they're arrested, they're not allowed to be.
We do that here too.
Right. It's a much more aggressive rate. So have you seen anything?
There is the European Union actually has a homelessness research and program contingent. And they are doing some of the same things we do in the United States. They do surveys, they try to study who is homeless. But really, when you think about it, homelessness is the confluence of a whole variety of issues. And so wherever you have circumstances that create the likelihood of those issues, particularly extreme poverty, and particularly deep racial divides, and particularly serious mental illness where we haven't really developed effective housing solutions, or people have sort of blown out of the housing solutions that they had because people, literally family and friends, couldn't stand to be with them anymore. And they've burned those bridges. They have similar problems. They also have shelters. They also have temporary housing programs. But I can't tell you I know the dimensions within each of the European states. I know that is an active area of study. Now, obviously, if you think about the United States and you think about our issues with homelessness and the million-plus people that are homeless in the United States tonight, you think about that compared to some areas of the world where people don't have $1 a day to pay for food, that are living on the dumps of the detritus of cities. We had I don't know if you remember the movie Slumdog Millionaire. That was quite an eye-opener, I thought, to see those kids running around the piles of stuff. It turned out we had just, an Indian woman had just joined our staff at Wilder Research. And I was talking to her about it one day, and she got very emotional. And I said, well, what's the matter? Trying to be sensitive, but stupid. And she said that I could have easily been one of those children. I was adopted, and had that not happened, I would have been one of those kids. And so I think every country has to put in perspective, given its standard of living and the expectations and the normative culture. But for America, one of the things that's happening now, and each year there are new studies that demonstrate this, we have further and further separation on the poles of the income and wealth spectrum. So I just saw something just the other day, and before I start my slides, I'm going to mention this. And I don't know if you want to look at this reference or not, but it's the Economic Advisors and Research Network. They published this in January 26, 2015. It was just published in the Strib. It was actually in the Wall Street Journal, but the Strib reprinted it on February 1. It's what percent of people are in the top 1%? Well, 1%. But I didn't quite mean to put it that way. It was the change in the percentage of persons from 1979 to 2007. What share of the income is going to the top 1%? So this is what share of income is going to the top 1% in the United States. So in Minnesota, in 1979, 9.3% of all income was earned by the top 1% of earners. 9.3%. I don't know if anyone else saw this. I feel like I got a cheat sheet in front of me. In 2007 in Minnesota, 17.8%. So to be in the top 1%, in Massachusetts, you have to earn $532,000 a year. In Minnesota, you have to earn $414,000 a year. I don't know if anyone has looked at the book Aftershock by Robert Reich. Robert Reich was, I think, Treasury Secretary under Clinton. Really interesting guy. He's short. He looks like one of those guys on the Borscht Belt circuit telling comedy. He's a really funny guy, and he's I think, a really intelligent guy. But he has been documenting this separation of wealth. And one of the facts that he has in his book that really just brought me to a stop was the fact that we have not seen the type of income and wealth gap that we have in the United States today, except for one previous time in our history, just before 1929. So I know that most of you in the room know what 1929 was, the humongous stock crash. It was the beginning of the end for many families, and if you look at the film of the era, you can see what a difficult life so many people had, and to come back from that, and how long it took. So this separation of wealth. And this concentration, the level of poverty in that bottom 1%, where you've got 1 out of 5 children in the United States today basically at or below the poverty line, it kind of sends shivers through a developed country's conscience and consciousness. And so I don't like to talk about homelessness all by itself, because homelessness has become a symptom of some of the desperate poverty that we have in the United States today, and the difficulty that we're having as a nation in housing the very poor. So you may have a variety of things that you think ought to be the solutions to this problem. I'm not going to go political on you here, but one of the things that you need to consider is that homelessness doesn't just come to us because someone has taken to the bottle too hard and they can't get sober and they've screwed up all their relationships and they're now out on the street. That's only one path. That's not how the over 3,000 children who are homeless tonight in Minnesota got there. Okay, any other questions? Whoa.
I'm curious, what percentage of the homeless are veterans?
The veteran population, among men, it's between 15 and 18% in the last few surveys. So it's actually been a fairly stable figure. Previously, we were getting a lot of Vietnam era. There still is a lot of Vietnam era. So they're getting older. One of the growth areas is in the 55-plus age group in homelessness. Not as large a group as children, but in a lot of those guys are veterans. So you have, coming back from the Vietnam War caused all kinds of scars, both because of the popularity of the war and the way in which those veterans were received. Now, we've got Iraq and Afghanistan veterans. We saw 69 of them in the 2012 survey. There were 69 that we interviewed in shelter locations. The rate of PTSD in that group was something like 60%. In addition to that, you've got the signature injuries of these Iraq and Afghanistan wars. These signature injuries of severe brain trauma. And so I just had a good friend that had a terrible stroke, and I'm recognizing how this TBI lines up with people that have strokes, but the sequencing of events. People, first of all, almost 30% of everyone who's homeless in Minnesota has at least 4 symptoms that tie in to traumatic brain injury. Now, whether or not all of those would check out as sort of full-fledged cases of TBI, I don't know, because we're just asking a few kind of symptomatic diagnostic questions. But the fact is that they are in that population now. Again, if you're unstable, if your relatives are scared of you, if you don't like being around people, if you're withdrawing, if you're drinking way too much, it's really easy to get isolated and just slip into homelessness. It's much easier than you might think. Yes?
Homestead County Social Services has a fund that will pay for homelessness. It's available through different ways, but my question is, this fund can only be used for those with mental health issues, drug issues, and drinking issues. A gentleman I met who was here for medical had none of those problems. He could not get any of the financial help from this fund. Is this fairly typical?
Well, I will say that the feds and the resources that they've made available to the states often target chronic homelessness. In fact, under the Bush administration, the primary focus was on long-term chronic homelessness. And so in those circumstances, if you look at the correlates of long-term chronic homelessness, you have substance abuse, either alcohol or drugs, severe mental illness. And so as a consequence, many of those dollars were targeted. Now, whether an individual community chooses to target dollars in that way, it depends on the source of the resources. Yes, please.
I had the privilege of being part of the St. Mary's program where
Oh.
your site for that reason.
Oh,
because
wow.
It was very enriching.
Thank you.
I now work in senior housing, assisted living and so on. And of course, with an older population, we have memory loss and dementia, but we also have those who are dealing with mental illness. And those two populations do not necessarily blend. They don't at all.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel your pain. We see it. Very difficult to find appropriate supportive housing
Right.
for those, because so many of us are geared toward maybe the dementia, the memory loss, and the physical needs.
We've seen that. One of the things that happened during the 90s and later through a lot of public housing, which had been primarily previously dedicated for elders. And it was basically senior housing, and you had to qualify to get into it. A lot of those housing programs were integrated because of the needs and the demands on some of those public housing facilities. Remember, the U.S. government stopped building new housing developments in 1982. That's how long it's been since they were building. I mean, we rely on Section 8 program. I don't know if you saw the headlines in the Minneapolis Star-Tribune recently. They opened up the Section 8 to 200, I think it was 200 or 300 more vouchers. They were going to give Section 8 vouchers, which are the vouchers that very low-income people can use so that they only have to pay a third of their income, whatever the cost of the housing, they only have to pay a third of their income toward it. There were 7,000, 8,000, 10,000 people lined up for those few hundred vouchers, and that waiting list had been closed for 2 years previously. And so they opened the waiting list for, I think, 3 days, a week. Someone in housing might know better than I. But the point is that the pressure on that housing was significant. And so you ended up having mixed populations. We provide an assisted living program in a public housing program, the Wilder Foundation. The program I'm from, there's a research group. There's about 75 or 80 of us. And then all the rest is direct service programs. And I happen to be the one that's evaluating the aging services. I think it was a part that I was meant to play in my dotage here. But in that program, they have the exact same issue that you described. And they are dealing with people that are elderly and also have serious and persistent mental illness and also have alcohol problems. And so in that mix of population, they're trying to manage their care so they don't fly back to the hospital through every episode, that they don't have ER admissions, that they're reasonably well cared for, that they're well fed, they get nutritious meals. It's a terrific challenge in public housing today to do that. And I think in all housing programs where there's sort of a more open admission policy. Sir, one more question and then I'm going to move on to some slides.
What do you think about wet houses?
Wet houses, very good question. So this gentleman asked about wet houses and a little bit about the concept of this. There are people that have been chronic inebriates for a long, long time. And there may be a variety. You don't have to know what the reasons are, but they have tried 16, 20 times. At one time we asked in our survey, how many times have you been admitted to detox? And we had people with over 100 admissions to detox. So that means they're having a little trouble with alcohol. And so what's the best thing to do? And there was a famous article in the New Yorker about this, about how to, called the $1 Million Murray. If anyone ever saw that article, you can look it up. It's in the New Yorker. And it was just weighing that issue of providing housing so that you basically reduce risk so that the person's not going to the ER, not getting arrested, not getting drunk on the street, not harassing everybody, but because they have some type of stable housing. There's a group in Minnesota now that I think does it very well, Center City Housing. They have a program in Rochester now. Oh, you know about this, okay. And they also have one in St. Cloud, and they also have one in Duluth, and that was their starting point. And they took over the old, I forget the name of the hotel up in Duluth. It was a kind of a mariner's hotel, a sailor's hotel. When they first took it over, there were prostitutes going in and out of that place, drug deals going in and out of that place, and they basically put just a few rules down. and then they kind of cleaned up the facility itself, put somebody at the front desk, and then rather than say, you don't drink, you can't drink here, they would say, we're going to do this activity tomorrow. If you show up sober, you can go. And so they're basically providing more positive incentives for people to take part in the community. And so really, to take part in the community, it's not like you're completely stopping their alcohol use. But if you're moderating their alcohol use, you are reducing the potential harm. And that's a very significant public health strategy today, reducing harm rather than seeking absolute cure. And so you may feel moralistic about this in one way or the other, but my personal opinion is I think they provide a very valuable purpose. They did that at Anishinaabe-Waukegan, which is the wet house in Minneapolis. And that was one, they swore, these guys, these are old Indians and they have been drunk a long time. They probably haven't had a sober day in the last 20 years. And they said, these guys will never come in. They will never come in the place. Well, first few months, there's still guys camped right outside. They wouldn't go into the building. But eventually, they moved in, they found it wasn't so bad, and they have done a significant harm reduction model in that place. And so I would say I'm a supporter. Okay, well, I could do this all night without looking at any slides, but I want to show a couple of slides because I think it'll be instructive. I mentioned this is a point-in-time survey. We pick one day, trained volunteer interviewers. October 25th, 2012, we interviewed in greater than 250 shelters and programs, and then outreach locations in more than 50 cities, towns, and outlying areas. And that was more than 50 sites, but in 50 different town or city locations. So that is a very big endeavor. And so I think the reason that I got this project is that I was too naive to know at the time just what a difficult project this was to pull off. And once you get pegged in a job, you may know this from your own work, once you get pegged in a job and you perform it well, you may have that job, until you drop. And this sort of seems to be our fate here. So these are the one-night study counts. I didn't do that animation. Only young people know how to do that stuff. These one-night counts from 1991, that was the first time we went statewide with the survey. And in 1991, is actually in 1990, the housing commissioner at the time, his name was Jim Solem. He was housing commissioner under several governors, both Democratic and Republican governors. He was a terrific guy. And he said, this Minneapolis-St. Paul homeless study you're doing is great, but we need you to do it statewide. And really, I think my knees buckled. I thought to myself, we were doing these intensive training programs to train the volunteers. We had to do all this recruiting of volunteers. We had to match the volunteers with the 350-plus sites we were going to. And so it was a very, very serious logistical nightmare. But, we started it, and we did it once the first year. We got a little bit better at it, a little bit better. So people always ask me, well, are these numbers going up just because you're getting better at this study? And I would say, perhaps a tinge, but not very much. We still go, just as we did in the very first study, to every shelter, every domestic violence shelter, every transitional housing program. And we would always go to the soup kitchens in any place that was a location where people were getting fed to try and find homeless individuals. And so at this kid by birth. What are his circumstances? He didn't do anything to get there, but Greg Owens was in that shelter that night. And so that touched me in a way that few things had touched me in the course of this interviewing. One other story I'll tell, and I promise I'll show you some more slides. And this was something that was really heart-wrenching for me. We got into the Union Gospel Mission. And by the way, if you want to look at the history of who's helped the homeless, look at religious organizations. It's all there. Whether you're talking about the gospel missions, the Catholic charities, the Lutheran social services, the churches, the meal programs put on by Catholic orders, the people that have been lifting, the hardest people to lift in our country, if you look back to the turn of the century, that was all religious organizations. It's all people that came to this work because of a moral consciousness about this really isn't right. We need to serve our brothers and sisters. But I remember going into the Union Gospel Mission that night. It's easy for me to get sidetracked on stories, I'm sorry. Went into the Union Gospel Mission that night, and we were interviewing guys. And the mission at that time had a policy, you couldn't have dinner until you went to the church service. And so all these guys were coming out of the church service, and they didn't really look like they wanted to be there, but they were there because they were going to get a hot meal, and we were intercepting them right as they're coming down to the hot meal. So they're not all that glad to see us either. And but I remember sitting down with a guy, and he looked about, I was 35 at the time, and I thought he looked about 65 or 70. We did the interview with him. He was 40. And but the thing that stood out, and I'll never forget, is the fact that his eyes were dead. That I looked at him, and it was like vacant. It was like there was nothing left there. And that's what you see if you want to talk about what the accumulated power of homelessness is for the truly long-term homeless that have never either been able to beat an addiction or deal effectively with their mental illness, is that you can instill a sense of complete hopelessness. And in this guy, that was the first time I'd ever looked it right in the face. A really resigned sense of complete hopelessness about his circumstances and situation. He could only focus on the next thing in front of him was he sang the songs at the church and he's going to get a meal. There's a lot of stories in this work, and a lot of stories now have been written because this problem has been examined for quite a while now in the United States. There's a huge literature. There's an encyclopedia of homelessness now. So we've almost created a culture of the science and the research around homelessness. I mean, we have created a culture of it. While maybe I shouldn't feel good about it, I'm a part of it. Because we always feel now we got to raise money for the study because the homeless will be there, and we've got to go out and find them, and we've got to talk with them, and we've got to tell their story. Okay. And then the unaccompanied young adults, 18 to 21, a big group, 10%. That is actually a big group. That's a very small age group, 18, 19, 20, and 21. It's 4 years. They represent 1/10, 1 out of 10 homeless people. One other statistic that's not in here that I'll tell you right now that really has shocked me over the past 10 years is the percentage of adults who, when we ask them when they were last homeless, when they first became homeless, they say, as a child. So when we started this study, there was only about 10%. We didn't have a really good way of asking that question back then, but we estimate maybe 1 out of 10 said that these adults, typically the younger age adults, said that they experienced homelessness first as a child. Now we're seeing upwards of 25% saying that they first experienced homelessness as a child among the adults. So again, think about a crucible. You keep pouring the stuff into it, and you just get this more concentrated and more concentrated solution of strife and distress and despair. Ages of children with their parents. This is another shocker for some folks. The average age of children who are with their parents is between 5 and 6. So that means half of those kids, half of those 3,000 kids that are in shelters are under 6 years old. So homeless families and children have made up the fastest growing segment of the population. I've mentioned this before. On a single night in 2012, there were 1,747 families and 3,546 children. They were in 1,500 of the families were in shelters, 221 were unsheltered. But again, that doesn't always mean they're like on the streets. They could be in these temporary arrangements. Frankly, there are more of that group than we know of because we can't count all that group. You would need to do literally a door-to-door census to find out how many people are housing somebody simply because they have so little income and so few resources that they're desperate and you've reached out and said, I'll help. Besides children who are homeless with their parents, at least another 2,000 are affected by a parent's homelessness, but they are not with that parent. Because we ask the parents, do you have children who are not with you? And so we find in that response to that question about another 2,000 children that are minors. Now, they could be with a stable parent. Their circumstances could be reasonably okay. We don't know. Where homeless children were counted, again, not in shelter, small, transitional housing. This is a good thing. I haven't given you a lot of good news tonight, so take this one. Transitional housing is more stable and longer term. It's typically anywhere from 60 to 90 days at the low end, up to 2 years. And I can tell you, because we just did a study of transitional housing programs, they oftentimes make exceptions when people can't find housing when it's time for them to leave. But in this, this means that these kids have a bit more stable setting. They typically have a bed for themselves. They typically have some security during the day. And amazingly, almost 90% of them go to school on a regular basis. Now, whatever political leanings you have, one thing I will say about No Child Left Behind is it put a lot of resources into the idea that every kid, no matter where they live, is going to go to school. And so, frankly, one of our more expensive transportation resources right now is the fact that we are going to every shelter in this state and making sure the kids in those shelters are going to school. Emergency shelter, battered women's, those are the proportions. These are from the parent interviews. Half of all homeless adults were parents of children aged 17 or younger. So half of all homeless adults were parents. 26% had at least one child. So of that half of that had at least one child with them. For a small proportion of parents reported not having their children with them because of program restrictions. And that happens when they have older kids with them. The data that follows are about parents whose children are living with them. So now I'm just going to focus on those kids where the parents. And did I go backwards there? Where homeless children were living. And so these were where the kids were living. The parents were that last chart might have been a little deceptive. I didn't realize I had both of these. I probably would have left one of those slides off. The reason that this is a little confusing compared to that other slide that I showed you, the transitional housing parents, 55%, where homeless children aged 0 to 17 were, this is where homeless children 0 to 5 were. So, actually, not quite as well off in terms of the longer term, more stable housing and transitional housing. 72% of children are with their mom, 4% are with their dads, and 24%, this is amazing. Literally, when we started this kind of study, there were like only 4 or 5% of the children that were with two-parent families. Today we have really, whether you say the growth of two-parent families in shelters is a good thing, maybe having two parents is a good thing, but having them in shelters is not necessarily a good thing. 29% of youth aged 21 and under are parents, and 21% have their children with them. So almost 30% of all the youth, and that's age 21 and under. And that's based on the state's definition for when they can receive services. So they're considered youth 21 and younger. Almost 30% are parents, and 21% have their children with them. Now, lots of times now, I don't know, any people here in this room have experience child protection or social service experience in the social services here in Rochester, work in child protection? Or Okay. I won't call you out on that stuff, but one of the things that's really significant is being homeless alone cannot be a reason to take your children and place them. Being homeless, just homeless, if that's all there is, that cannot be a reason for removing a child from the home. There has to be something else going on. But the fact is, lots of times, there is other stuff going on. And so a lot of these parents, especially parents in transitional housing, you find, I'm working on getting my kids back. I'm working on getting my kids back. I'm working on getting sober. Or I'm working on getting my meds regulated so that I am not acting so crazy. Median age for homeless parents is 29. This is the racial thing. Oh, yes, please. 45% of all of the people in our survey have been in an emergency room within the past 6 months. So, where's the most expensive place to get care? Go to an emergency room. So, I don't think we're having a lot of outdoor births. I don't think we're seeing them in the backs of barns. I don't think that's happening. I think basically the public dollar is paying for a lot of births. And people basically are racking up debt that they will never be able to pay off. One thing that's kind of amazing, we ask a question in our study, do you have a need to see a doctor about any kind of health problem now? It's a relatively small percent. And when we ask what proportion have insurance coverage, it's over 90%. So they're on Minnesota Care. They're, with the health exchange now, under the Affordable Care Act, people are mandated to have insurance. We actually have a fairly high rate of coverage in our state. Now, getting dental care for a child, that's nigh on to impossible if you're poor, because more and more dentists are not willing to accept the incredibly low payment that Medicaid, that's the free health program for persons that are very poor, they're not willing to accept the level of payment that Medicaid is paying for. So even Head Start parents, they can't get the required dental examinations in a timely way. This is the racial disparity stuff that I was talking about earlier, and you can see homeless parents, children age 0 to 5, 44% black. Now that could be both African American and African. I live in South Minneapolis, so we're basically the location of one of the largest Somali populations outside of Mogadishu. We have a very significant Somali population. And so there are actually many Africans. Liberians make up about 25,000 of the Twin Cities population now. So we have significant immigration of Africans, both East and West Africans in the United States. So that is actually a relatively small proportion of this. Most of these are African-born, African-American, American-born blacks, not African-born. White represents 30%. They represent 86% of the total population of Minnesota, but 30% of the shelter population. And then other multiracial, again, 9% versus 3%, 8% versus 4%. And American Indian, 9% versus 1% in the population of those that are parents and homeless. Here's the history of homelessness. Homeless at least a month. What time do we go till 8:30? Yes. Till 8:30. And do you want me to? Also, I was going to stop at quarter after and just do questions. That sound all right? Okay. Thanks, Chancellor. Here we go. Homeless at least a month, 92%. Spent at least one night in the last 30 days outside, about 1 out of 10. Spent at least one night in the last 30 days, doubled up with somebody. So what I want you to get you a feel for is that their shelter arrangements aren't steady or stable. You move from place to place. And if you want to create about the worst learning conditions for a child, start moving them every day. Get them moving all over the place. Make them not know where they're going to sleep at night. And you can pretty much count on incredibly poor school performance. First experienced homelessness as a child. Look at this. Homeless parents with children age 0 to 5. Look what percent of those parents first experienced homelessness as a child themselves. So if you want to talk about intergenerational poverty, here's a good place to start. This is a really serious problem. If we are not able to begin while a child is very young to solve the homelessness for that child's parent, there's a very good possibility that that child will then become a homeless adult. Here are the health problems. We've talked about those before. Serious mental health problems, chronic physical health problems, chemical dependency issues. Now, you may say, well, this is a self-report survey. People don't say very much about what's really going on. We're always amazed at how much people do say. I remember Almanac, one of the guys that worked for Almanac, went around and did interviews with people after the study one time. And they said, I remember was one guy, he was interviewed up in Duluth, and he said, you know, these people are here to tell our story. They don't take my name, they don't write my name down or anything like that. They want to tell the story. And so I tell them. And quite honestly, in a face-to-face interview, you're sitting one-on-one with a person, and it's not some invisible face. It's a volunteer who's coming out that night to talk to people that are homeless, and giving that person a chance to tell their story through this 300-question interview. And although it sounds like it might be an ordeal, it's unbelievable how much people will express in this survey. It's easier to get people to talk about substances than it is to get them to talk about sex or money. But has chemical dependency issues, 9%. I suspect the proportion is somewhat higher. Lived in Minnesota more than 2 years. 8 out of 10 parents with very young children are homegrown. It's not this vast in-migration. They're not all coming from Chicago. Some come from Chicago, some come from St. Louis, some come from Milwaukee. It's true. Some go there. Some go to Southern California, some go to Florida. There is migration among homeless people too. 8 out of 10 Minnesotans. For those recent Minnesota transplants, where'd they come from? These are the states. Other characteristics, and I mentioned this on the waiting list for Section 8. They just opened it up, a few hundred slots for thousands of people. Employed, 11% have full-time employment. Now, back in 2000, we were beginning to turn the corner, and the number of children started slooping down there for a while. Back in 2000, 25% of homeless people had jobs. They had jobs of significant hours each week. We fell to 12, 18, 16, 14%. During the recession, we only had 6% that had full-time jobs. So this is an improvement from the 2009 figures. Received food stamps, received WIC. I won't go into all these programs, but see me later if you want to talk about those programs. Received child care assistance, physically or sexually abused as a child or youth. Again, you've got about half of this population that are coming out of circumstances where they've been beaten up so much in their own experiences, it's going to be hard for them to really be effective parents for their young children. I'm going to stop there. There's a few other slides. We're going to load this on the University of Minnesota Rochester Connects website, and I'm assured that we can get a link to it. So if you all want to be deputized tonight to take these slides to your church groups, feel free. I have no guardedness about these things. I'm really happy to have other people tell this story. So think of me tonight as the sheriff, and now you're all deputies. And so take this information wherever you can find it useful. So I'm going to stop with that, and I'll take questions for as long as you got them, at least till 8:30. Please. Yep.
I was just wondering, in all these 30 years that you've been doing this study, have you identified in any best practices over those 30 years that either regionally or by state or by city, by communities, that are consistently high-quality practices that can be adopted by other communities?
Right. A couple things. If you look at the nature of the problems that we've discussed tonight, serious or persistent mental illness, physical sexual abuse in childhood, I remember when we studied delinquents that were under 10 years of age, they couldn't be arrested because they were under 10. Minnesota doesn't allow that. We found 252 in the drawers of the county attorney's office. We studied those 252 kids. What we concluded after that was that they were in families that were the perfect socializing institutions to create adult criminals. 90% of the parents had criminal backgrounds. The 70% were in the child protection system. Another and a similar proportion of their older teens were also in juvenile corrections already. So they were being socialized to be adult criminals. So when you ask the question, what's the best practice? I'm saying the best practices are you got to look early. You got to look at where this river starts. This river doesn't just start full blown. And so, we mentioned a couple best practices tonight. I think permanent supportive housing is an excellent best practice for serious and persistent mental illness. We've got roughly 4,000 people with serious or persistent mental illness that are homeless. Our homeless statewide plan created 4,000 units. That's great. But that 4,000 units will serve that year's population. What about the next group that becomes homeless and the next group after that? Are we going to continue to keep building permanent supportive housing and paying for it out of the government coffers and out of taxpayer dollars? Or are we going to be beginning to look at the child protection systems and the range of activities that go in there? We talked about another best practice, which I personally think the evidence strongly supports as a harm reduction strategy, is wet houses. I think when you've got really long-term chronic inebriate people that are never going to be hired by any employer, I think it would be better if we gave them safe housing. So there are a variety of other practices for interventions. Since depression is significant, we have a lot of moms with depression. If you look at that serious and persistent mental illness among the moms, a lot of that is depression. If you intervened early with effective interventions with depression, you could have a much different scenario for some of these parents. One of the physicians that I saw at one of the meetings a few years ago was really excited. He just got out of medical school and residency, and he was a psychiatrist, and he was just focused on the idea that, man, just a little bit of treatment here, just really focusing on this depression issue, and getting at some of those things that are causing the depression could make a really substantial difference. So those are some elements of it. The literature is replete with lots of different programs. There are different evidence-based strategies for how do you get them off the street, different evidence-based strategies for how do you get people employed, what's the on-ramp to employment. We worked with guys coming out of prison. We had a Wilder program that was focused on people coming out of prison. And one of the practices we developed, which turned out to be evidence-supported, was Job Club. Get these folks together. Get them talking about what it means to get a job. Have them do mock interviews with people. Have them have to prepare a resume. Tell them during these conversations of the mock interviews that they can't strut their stuff and show all big in these interviews, that they have to present to an employer like they're a credible person and that they want this job. And they have to learn how to reasonably talk about their criminal record. So I think it's a great question, and I think we should all look for evidence that supports good strategies. The thing that in this area, to me, is just a bit daunting is that when you look at the causes, when you look at what's under those roots, there are a variety of things that relate to some of the permanent elements of our normative culture. And by that I mean our agreed upon ways of doing things. That's what our normative culture is. It's our generally agreed upon ways of doing things, the way we do things. And part of that normative culture is just how we've accommodated to race over the time period of our history and the ways in which we now understand and respond to race in our culture. That's a few things, and I'll be glad to talk more about that. You're right in front. Yes?
I don't really know what I'm talking about.
She wants to give you the microphone, ma'am.
I don't really know what I'm talking about, but maybe you can fill us in. I read in the real estate section of a financial paper some time ago that a deal had gone through where the Franciscan Fathers had asked the city of New York to come up with a certain amount of money to buy housing for their schizophrenic people. Now, my question is, do the San Franciscan Fathers have hospitals for schizophrenics? Do they have shelters for schizophrenics? Do they have housing? What is it? Do you know?
I don't. It's a great
I
question.
can't find anybody that knows.
I don't know. Those youngins in the audience, Google Franciscan Fathers in New York and see what you can come up with. There are lots of different organizations that are trying to make inroads. Much as that question about evidence, what works. A lot of people want to know more and more about what works, and partly what works is authentic relationships. Having authentic relationships with people. And so these Franciscan brothers may have come behind a group of people that have schizophrenia, and they're realizing we need resources to help this problem. We're going to need to bring a doctor in here. They're going to have a regular clinic. We're going to have to do some medical med management for these folks. We're going to have to give them a stable place to live if we're going to get them fixed. And I visited a place in Georgia that was like this. I visited places in other parts of the United States that are focused on this. Some of them, one of the practices employed by a facility in Savannah, Georgia. Don't probably think about homelessness in Savannah, Georgia. The house, ghosts and big houses. But in Savannah, Georgia, they developed sort of a continuum of care shelter where they had an emergency shelter, and then to that was connected a transitional housing program, and then to that was connected a culinary training program. And so they were training people to have jobs. And I found out that People Serving People in our own Minneapolis also has a culinary training program that they are helping people to transition to. They use rapid exit dollars. HUD has these things called rapid exit dollars. The problem is that it's hard to rapidly exit people from homelessness where you don't really have housing stock, where you don't have affordable housing stock. You may have a few resources to get them out, but you can't sustain them at high market rates. But I think you need to look into that Franciscan Brothers or Fathers thing a little bit more. There are really good people all over the country trying to do things to alleviate this problem. Please.
Something you just said, I want to make a statement on first before my question, and that's, you talked about authentic relationships. Many of the folks that are here tonight I recognize as longtime volunteers in the community, but that's the one thing that we can all do to make a real difference, is to get connected and make authentic relationships with folks that are in that situation. It's the only way to try to spread some of that hope that really makes a difference. And my question for you, kind of connecting it back with the prison poverty and homelessness, when you showed us the breakdown by race, African Americans were overrepresented by 10 times, American Indians by 9. Those are also the two groups that tend to be overrepresented in incarceration. Have you scrubbed those numbers at all, taking a look at, if you look at only those who haven't been incarcerated by race or only those who have been incarcerated by race, to give an idea of what it would look like?
That's a good question. See me about a job in our analysis department. It's a really good question. One of the things that we have a lot of trouble doing, so let me give you a picture of this. We have 5,000 interviews filled out by 1,200 different people, all arriving in our office over about a 3-week period. Some are mailed in, some are shipped in, some are hand-delivered, some by people gasping to get the data off their shelf and onto ours. So we got all of those interviews. Then we go through them. And we've already got about a dozen funders, each of whom wants some special slice of the data. So we meet that need. And then we have to publish several different types of reports, and we meet those needs. And so typically, the people that get those questions answered, and that's a good one, the people that get those kinds of questions, such as what is the correlation and the associations between parents and past experience of incarceration, and what about those that don't have past experience of incarceration? How different do they look? What are the comparative characteristics of that population? We could write literally 1,000 fact sheets after every study. We're funded to write about 100. Keep those questions coming, and I think I'm going to take that one home with me. We have not looked at that incarceration history deeply with parents, and I think it could be very interesting. Yes, please.
Last question.
Oh, we're at time. They're going to call time. Get out of here. They know I have to drive back in the snow.
Just on that question there, is the data available if somebody was
Yes.
interested in actually
Yep.
examining it?
Yep, we have the data. We have all cycles of the data. We've got them all now living in the similar place. It's complicated data. We do a lot of variable creation. So by that I mean, for those that are analyst types, we sort of recombine certain values of the variables so that we create some new variables. We combine certain variables so that we create indicators of level of mental illness, etc. And then we weight the data just to make it a little bit messier. And so we do actually give this data set out to universities and colleges. We just, I get these reports that, we just published you in this study. It shows up in this journal. Well, there's a lot of money right now about smoking cessation. You have one of the world's leading experts down here, Richard Hurt, who's one of the leading experts in smoking cessation and nicotine addiction in the world. He goes everywhere. He came up to entertain at one of my meetings one time to teach people what smoking addiction is like. And he drew on the board, I'll never forget this, he drew on the board this picture of a Pac-Man, and people of my generation know exactly what Pac-Man is. Pac-Man is one of those things that keeps getting bigger and bigger the more it gobbles. And he says, that's the nicotine receptor in your brain. Anyway, some of our published studies are done by the University of Minnesota in the nicotine research because they're really interested in nicotine addiction among homeless people. And so if they get a lot of money for that, they'll come, and those will be the people that'll slice and dice the data. So there are a bunch of studies that are out there publishing from our data sets. And so any credible organization that comes to us and says, we'd like to look at that data, would like to have a chance to analyze that with you and be your partner in that, we'll look at them. So, back to you. Thank you.
And I will actually have you pick our door prize winner for tonight.
Okay. I know I'm not in here because I didn't fill out a form. I have to look at my glasses. Joe Derone? Joe!
Congratulations.
Way to go, Joe. I love your email address. Way to go, Joe.
And thank you, everybody, for coming out tonight.